Hello YouTube! In this video I'm going to examine an argument against external world skepticism that works from the idea that there is something morally questionable about skepticism. Now, if you have seen my videos before, I'm sure you're probably all too familiar with skepticism at this point, but just to introduce this a little bit. So the external world skeptic, the classic argument for external world skepticism proceeds by introducing a skeptical hypothesis. So this is going to be a hypothesis that is consistent with all of our experiences, or at least all of my experiences. The hypothesis is consistent with all of my experiences, but if that hypothesis is true, almost all of my beliefs about the world turn out to be false. So for example, the brain in a vat hypothesis. Maybe I am a brain in a vat being controlled by some evil neuroscientist. Some super powerful computer is feeding my brain, all of the relevant impulses to create the appearance of an external world. But of course I'm just completely deceived. So the argument goes, if I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat, I don't know that I have hands. I don't know I'm not a brain in a vat, so I don't know I have hands. So the external world skeptic says, look, in order to have knowledge of a claim such as I have hands, in order to have this kind of ordinary knowledge, I would need to rule out these skeptical hypotheses, such as the brain in a vat hypothesis. But there is nothing I can do to rule it out, because my experiences would be indistinguishable from how they are now, even if I were a brain in a vat. I have no evidence that distinguishes the common sense worldview that I'm a person with a human body surrounded by objects such as tables and chairs from the skeptical hypothesis that I'm a brain in a vat. And of course the brain in a vat is just one among many skeptical hypotheses. The point is, I can't really know anything about the external world, or at least I can't know very much about it. Chris Renali, in his paper Is Radical Doubt Morally Wrong?, presents a moral argument against skepticism. And I think we can think about two types of anti-skeptical positions here. So there's anti-skeptical moralism, which is what Renali argues for, which just says that it's morally wrong to give up ordinary beliefs, regardless of the evidence for those beliefs. Well, maybe not all ordinary beliefs, but there's certain ordinary beliefs about the external world that it's going to be morally wrong to give up, no matter what the evidence is. Then there's weak anti-skeptical moralism, which says that it is morally permissible to maintain certain ordinary beliefs, regardless of the evidence for those beliefs. So this doesn't say that it's necessarily wrong to give any of these beliefs up. It's just it's morally permissible to maintain them. It's okay to keep believing all of the things that you believed, regardless of whether you actually have evidence for them. Now, this distinction is not going to really matter too much going forward, but I think it's worth keeping in mind that there are two things that the moralist might say here. She might say that you are sort of obligated to keep holding certain ordinary beliefs, or she might just say, look, you are permitted, morally permitted to do so. But the basic idea on both of these views is that even if the external world skeptic is right that there is not sufficient evidence to epistemically justify our beliefs, well, we don't have to give them up. Or maybe we ought not give them up, right? Epistemic justification is not the only kind of justification. The epistemic point of view is not the only point of view. Our beliefs are also guided by moral considerations, and morality weighs heavily in favour of maintaining certain beliefs, even in the absence of evidence for them. Now, as Renali notes, moralists may or may not endorse skeptical arguments. The moralist may think that skeptical arguments successfully show that we lack epistemic justification. But then she will say, those arguments do not in themselves entail that we ought to suspend judgment about anything, because they don't address the ethical dimensions of belief revision. So the moralist might just say, yeah, the skeptic is right about her argument. She's right that there's no real evidence for external world beliefs. But so what, right? That's not it's not just about the evidence. So there's still work to be done in order to show that you should suspend judgment about the external world. Or, of course, the moralist might think that the skeptical arguments fail in any case. So she might say that there is evidence in favour of our beliefs, but even if there weren't, that still wouldn't show that we ought to give them up. So, I mean, a moralist can have either of these views. Okay, so that's what moralism is. Now we're going to have a look at some arguments for moralism. So I want to begin with an initial, a sort of first moral argument, which is not an argument that Rinaldi gives, but I think it's just worth considering. I think it's an argument that might occur to a lot of people. So the thought about this first argument is this. External world skepticism obviously entails all of what we might call the local skepticisms. So by local skepticism, I just mean skepticism about some specific thing. So like in philosophy of religion, you know, an agnostic will claim that we can't know whether or not God exists. An agnostic is a skeptic specifically with respect to God. Now, if I'm an external world skeptic, I'm going to be a religious agnostic, right? Because, you know, God, if she exists, would be external to me. So external world skepticism entails skepticism of God, right? God is just one of these things that would be part of the external world. And if I can't know anything about the external world, well, I can't know whether God exists, right? So the thought is that there are many types of local skepticisms that are harmful. So think about, for instance, skepticism of the causal link between smoking and cancer, or skepticism about whether the Holocaust occurred, or skepticism of climate change, or skepticism of dietary recommendations. See my video, Dietary Nihilism, for a somewhat sympathetic presentation of skepticism of dietary recommendations. But anyway, I'll link that in the comments. Anyway, the point is, skepticism in these cases, the argument will be made that skepticism in these specific local instances is harmful. Now, I mean, look, you might not agree with all of these specific examples, okay? So maybe you think that actually it's perfectly reasonable to be skeptical of, you know, the current consensus on climate change, or it's perfectly reasonable to be skeptical about, you know, dietary recommendations. As I said, I have a video where I do try to present the skepticism of dietary recommendations, and I try to give it a run for its money. So I mean, you know, you might just say, well, actually, these local skepticisms are all perfectly fine. These examples are intended to be merely illustrative, okay? There's bound to be, for most people, there are bound to be some local skepticisms that they will admit could be harmful. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that climate change really is happening and that it really is caused by human activity, but that fossil fuel companies are intentionally spreading misinformation to make people doubt climate change so that they can continue polluting unimpeded. That scenario, in that case, if that's true, climate skepticism has negative consequences. And, you know, and frankly, you're kind of a sucker if you buy into it, right? Like, you have fallen for the propaganda, you know, so, you know, it's bad. You don't want to do that. You don't want to be a sucker for the fossil fuel industry, or for anything else for that matter, right? So sometimes skeptical arguments are immoral. Sometimes it is immoral to withhold belief. And if you think that skepticism in any of these local cases is immoral, well, surely it follows that global skepticism is immoral, you know, because I mean, if you're just a skeptic of the external world in general, then obviously you have to accept skepticism in all of these local cases. A skeptic of the external world is going to be a skeptic of the consensus on climate change. A skeptic of the external world is going to be a skeptic of the consensus dietary recommendations, etc. Right? And isn't that very nice for the fossil fuel companies? Isn't that very nice for, you know, the food industry, right? So yeah, I mean, the thought is, look, you're just going to be easily manipulated into taking actions and holding beliefs in a way, or well, not holding beliefs, but like suspending judgment in a way that's harmful to yourself and others. So the argument here is fairly simple, right? I mean, we're basically saying, look, premise one, if P entails Q, and it is immoral to hold Q, then it is immoral to hold P. Premise 2, external world skepticism entails climate skepticism, but climate skepticism is immoral, so external world skepticism is immoral. And obviously you can substitute for climate skepticism whatever local skepticism you think has negative consequences. Is this argument convincing? So, a couple of issues with this, I think. So one point that is worth bearing in mind here is that, I mean, obviously, it's true on paper that external world skepticism entails these local skepticisms. But I think that if we're a bit more careful about, what exactly these local skepticisms are saying, it's not actually obvious that they are entailed by external world skepticism. So let me explain. Let's take skepticism with regard to climate change. The thing is that when we're talking about external world skepticism, we're talking about somebody who just suspends judgment about everything to do with the external world, right? I mean, they didn't even really know whether the external world exists at all. And obviously one skeptical hypothesis is just that there is no external world whatsoever, and this is just a hallucination, a dream, whatever. There's only my mind. But certainly, if you're an external world skeptic, you are not going to hold any particular beliefs about what is going on out there, or whether there's an out there at all. When you look at climate skeptics, though, and specifically, the kind of movement that is, essentially being promoted by fossil fuel companies, right? When you look at that kind of climate skepticism, they endorse a number of contentious claims. Indeed, the reason why they doubt the link between burning fossil fuels and climate change is because of these background beliefs. It's because of these background claims that they're endorsing. So, for instance, a climate skeptic might argue that the data presented by climate scientists has been manipulated, such as that there's that famous controversy about the hockey stick graph, right, where it was argued that the graph was constructed out of cherry-picked data. That's a really contentious claim. I mean, that's something that, if you're an external world skeptic, you're certainly not going to accept that claim, right? It's very much open to debate, right? So the point is, it's really not clear that climate skeptics have fewer beliefs or make fewer assumptions than their opponents, or indeed that they are in any sense more skeptical than their opponents. What they're skeptical they're about one specific thing, right? Which is the link between burning fossil fuels and climate change. Or maybe even, maybe not even that. I mean, it might just be that they are skeptical about the idea that climate change is going to be harmful or whatever. But there's some very specific points on which, they don't accept, the current scientific consensus. But actually, what's driving that is this prior acceptance of a host of very controversial ideas. So again, it is true that external world skepticism entails skepticism regarding climate change, but the way that they've arrived at that has got absolutely nothing to do with the sort of modern climate skeptic movement. And of course, if we think about it politically, it seems obvious that climate skeptics would want to distance themselves from external world skeptics, because the modern climate skeptic movement is trying to it has a kind of political goal, right? I mean, it's trying to lend credibility to the idea that we don't really need to worry about burning fossil fuels. And the goal is to resist these regulations on fossil fuel use. Now, an external world skeptic is going to come along and say, well, look, I have no idea whether there are humans or planets or climates or anything else like that, right? They don't have any particular political goals at all. And it seems like, to most people, what the external world skeptic is saying here is going to look pretty crazy. Or if you think about, debates about things like, teaching the controversy in schools, well, that question doesn't even arise for an external world skeptic. The external world skeptic doesn't believe there are any schools. And then even if we were to grant that there were schools, the external world skeptic would be doubtful that there's any way of teaching children, or that teaching children would be a good thing even if you could do it, etc. And of course, I think these same points could be made for any of these let's call them, potentially harmful local skepticisms, is that if you if you just take it as like, well, I look at the proposition, then yes, it's in some sense external world skepticism entails these things. But when you look at the actual positions that are held by people, that doesn't really look so plausible. Now, of course, this doesn't entirely resolve the worry, because if I believe that climate change is occurring and is caused by human activity, well, the external world skeptic suspends judgment about that. So the external world skeptic has no reason to be concerned. So I mean, it's like, on the one hand, they may not be giving any comfort to, the climate skeptics, right? But they're not going to be helping my side out in any way either. The external world skeptic has no reason to change their behavior, to urge anyone else to change their behavior, to push for more stringent regulations on fossil fuel use or anything like that. And, it might be said, look, well, that's a problem. I mean, inaction in the face of these massive harms is morally bad. So don't we still have a bit of a problem here? Okay, so this brings us to the next issue, though, with this general strategy of argument. I think the main limitation of any argument along these lines of appealing to these harmful local skepticisms is, well, look, the external world skeptic suspends judgment about whether there's a planet, about whether climate change is occurring, and so on. And so, yeah, I mean, they are just not going to agree that there's any reason to believe that there's actually anything to worry about here, right? I mean, maybe there is, but they just don't know. So this moral argument can only appeal to people who already reject this kind of skepticism. So it's like, yeah, if you reject external world skepticism, then you can see that external world skepticism might have harmful consequences here, but it seems like you're already going to have some kind of independent reason to reject external world skepticism in order to get on board with this moral argument. So, I mean, to see why this is an issue, note that this moral argument against skepticism is really more general. It's not just a moral argument against skepticism, it's a moral argument against disbelieving any proposition where such disbelief would have negative consequences if the proposition in question is actually true. So turning to the case of climate change, right? Let's say that Siena believes the standard story. Burning fossil fuels is causing climate change is going to have all sorts of negative consequences. Okay, so from Siena's point of view, refraining from agreeing with her has these negative consequences, because it means, okay, well, if you don't believe that climate change is occurring, or that human activity is causing climate change, then you're not going to take the appropriate action to regulate fossil fuel use, right? That's from Siena's point of view. Okay, well, now imagine Pearl, right? Pearl is a climate skeptic. Pearl thinks that there are negative consequences to refraining from climate skepticism. Pearl thinks there are negative consequences to believing the standard story. Because Pearl's going to say, well, look, if you believe the standard story, that has disastrous economic implications, given the cost of giving up fossil fuels. Also, Pearl will say, modern science has been captured by these political interests, and it's important for the sake of our project of inquiry into the world and free inquiry and so on, that we resist that, and that we overturn this. You should be doing something to resolve this. This is a real problem. So from Pearl's point of view, refraining from her brand of climate skepticism has negative consequences. So it looks like a moral argument here is going to serve Pearl just as well as it serves Siena. And so, again, the thought is, well, yeah, I mean, if I already believe these things, then, if I already believe this some proposition, and I can then think, okay, well, refraining from believing in that proposition is going to have negative consequences. In itself, that's not really much of an argument, because I'm only going to accept that if I already believe the proposition, right? So we'd need some kind of independent reason to believe the proposition. So the question is, can we do better here? I mean, can there be a moral argument against external world skepticism that might actually be compelling to an external world skeptic? Can there be a moral argument that doesn't depend on contingent features of the external world, so that you could be compelled to believe in an external world even if you start from the position that you're not really sure whether there's an external world? Well, just before I get to that, I should note that, I have a Patreon which you can send me money on, or a PayPal where you can send me money. If you want to send me money, you can do it at these places. And I would really appreciate it because, these videos take a lot of time and effort. So anything that you can contribute to help keep this going is very much appreciated. I'd like to keep this going. I think that this is, this is worthwhile. But I mean, you've got to pay the bills. So if you can help out, I'd appreciate it. Right, let's get back to the moral argument against skepticism. So I said, can we do better? Can there be a moral argument against external world skepticism that might be compelling to an external world skeptic? And this is where Chris Rinaldi's argument comes in. So Rinaldi basically states a kind of trilemma for external world skepticism, and it's based on our sort of responsibilities when it comes to loving relationships. So according to Rinaldi, just to sum it up briefly, he says that skepticism entails either giving up beliefs in a way that risks wronging those we care about, depriving oneself of the relevant sorts of relationships, which is a serious limitation, or continuing with them anyway, undermining one's authenticity. Okay, that's the basic idea, but let's expand on this. So Rinaldi focuses on what he calls basic eros and philia beliefs. So these are, I quote, those beliefs which are necessary for the truth and coherence of more fine-grained, personal, loving relationship beliefs. For instance, if you are a parent, you presumably have a close relationship with your children, and you take it that you love each other. You care for your children, and your children care for you, and so there's a shared, reciprocal relationship. But all this requires the belief that your children exist. If your children don't exist, they wouldn't be able to hold any particular attitude towards you, so there would be no possibility of shared feelings. So the belief, my children exist, is therefore necessary for the coherence of your other beliefs about your children. In terms of hinge epistemology, the belief my children exist might be thought of as a hinge proposition with respect to interactions with your children. See my video on hinge epistemology, which I'll link in the comments. Anyway, if the external world skeptic is right, you have no reason to believe that your children exist, and that leaves you with three options. Okay, the first option is, given that you have no reason to believe your children exist, you could just give up the belief that your children love you, and so you just end the relationship with your children. If you take this option, you recognize that since you don't believe your children exist, you can't believe that a shared relationship is possible, so you just end the relationship. That would be a pretty serious deprivation for obvious reasons. And of course, notice the point here is, it's a deprivation for you. I mean, there's also an additional moral concern that it would be harmful to the children themselves, but if you're an external world skeptic, you don't believe that the children exist. And I mean, even if you do exist, even if they do exist, you have no belief about whether this would help or harm them, I suppose. But even an external world skeptic can believe that if they were to stop relating to their children, if that sequence of experiences were to cease, it would be a serious harm to themselves. You'd be making yourself much worse off. So this is bad for you. You don't want to take this option. Okay, option number 2 is give up the belief that your children love you, but you just continue relating to your children as you did before. So if you take this option, although you recognize that you have to suspend judgment about whether a shared relationship is possible, you just continue to with the relationship anyway. Now, according to Rinaldi, this would be cruel and hurtful both to yourself and to your children. And the reason why is that you're lying. You're engaging in a lie, basically. You're lying to your children by maintaining your practical relations with them. You're acting and perhaps even speaking as if you believe there to be a shared relationship, as if you believe that you love each other. But this just isn't true. So the idea is that there are certain interpersonal beliefs that are, as Rinaldi says, necessary for the authenticity and integrity of love and friendship. It is possible to have friends and loved ones without holding these interpersonal beliefs, but this involves you in a moral failing. And this is because of the kind of commitments that are part of a loving relationship. So, like, let's say that somebody comes along and starts bad-mouthing your children, spreading lies about them. Well, the thought is you owe it to your children to take a stand against this and to correct the accusation. But if you're an external world skeptic, you can't actually believe that the accusation is false. For all you know, there's just as much chance that the accusation is actually true. So, I mean, you can't do anything about this. Or at least if you did, again, you would be lying. Or suppose that somebody says these sorts of things to you. They say, look, your children's lives are not worth living, your children don't really love you, etc. Well, again, you ought to take a stand and say, no, their lives are worth living. But if you're a skeptic, you don't actually believe that, or you don't even believe there are any children there anyway to have lives that could be worth living or not worth living. So, again, you can't honestly state either of these things, and as such, you fail to meet the basic commitments of the relationship. And by continuing this relationship without the right sort of commitments, this is an immoral attitude. And this is, I think what we could argue here is that this is a moral issue regardless of whether your children actually exist, because the point is about maintaining a relationship with this vicious attitude. You can be judged negatively for that, even if you're just in like an experience machine or something. So Ranelli concludes that it is prima facie wrong to lack intimate interpersonal belief whilst continuing to engage in intimate interpersonal action. Now, Ranelli does raise the potential objection that all that's really necessary for participation in loving relationships is what he calls the phenomenology of care, and not any kind of belief or credence. The idea here is that all that's really required is, well, basically just a matter of your feelings. And feelings are not necessarily responsive to belief. I mean, consider the person on an airplane who's terrified that it will crash, despite knowing that a crash is extremely unlikely. So, why shouldn't we just sort of maintain relationships on the basis of just, feelings, right? Why do we have to have beliefs? Ranelli's response to this is a little bit obscure to me. He says that it's hard to see how a spouse might be said to authentically partake in love with her partner if, for example, she's not even remotely convinced that her partner loves her, nor that she loves her partner. But that response just seems to me to be basically repeating that just seems like repeating the earlier point. I mean, I'm not really sure how this actually addresses the objection, but I suppose there are three worries that I can think of here, which is, so first of all, beliefs and feelings are not actually so separate. If you suspend judgment about whether somebody exists, that might well erode the phenomenology of care. It might erode the feelings. I mean, fear of flying is not completely unresponsive to the belief that flying is in fact perfectly safe. I mean, if you really believed that the plane was highly likely to crash, you'd probably feel a lot more scared. So feelings, there is some sort of connection here between the feelings and the belief, right? The second thing is that if you have these feelings but you don't have the belief, it looks like you have to judge the feelings to be irrational in some sense. I mean, when we think about the plane crash case, the person who's terrified of the plane crash is being irrational. They ought to change their feelings. So maybe the same sort of worry is, in this case, is that you're going to be, or you maybe epistemically ought to judge your feelings to be irrational. There's another point as well, which Ranelli makes a bit later, which is, he says, well, consider how the loved one would feel if they knew your skeptical doubts, right? Like, if you told your children that you doubted whether they loved you, they would be deeply hurt by your lack of belief. I mean, Ranelli says, they'd sort of say, like, what kind of person are you to think that way about me? Merely saying that you have the right feelings for them probably wouldn't allay that concern. So if you reveal your doubts, you would hurt them, and that's of course bad. If you keep your doubts to yourself, you're lying, which is bad. And so the point is that if your loved ones do in fact exist, then they would be hurt by your lack of belief. And to maintain this relationship while still taking that risk is again morally questionable. And even the external world skeptic can admit that it's a risk here, because you don't know whether they exist, but they might exist, right? So Rinaldi thinks, the second option, where you give up the belief that your children love you, but you continue relating to them as you did before, that's morally wrong. All right, so the third option then is to continue believing that your children love you, and that's just it. You despite suspending judgment about whether they exist, you just carry on holding the belief anyway. So this obviously immediate worry here is this is just kind of incoherent. I mean, you're continuing to hold the belief that they love you, even though you know that they could only love you if they exist. So you have a situation where you admit you have no reason to hold the belief, but you believe it anyway. So there's a worry that this is incoherent. Moreover, Rinaldi says that on this approach, you're no longer going to be authentic in your skeptical doubt, right? So it's going to be a kind of situation where you give up your belief when you're considering the skeptical arguments, but then you just hold the belief again when you're interacting with your children. But then, are you really a skeptic? I mean, this is essentially Hume's response to skepticism, right? Hume grants that the skeptical challenge can't be overcome, but then he says, well, when you leave the philosophy seminar room and you start playing billiards with your friends, all your beliefs reassert themselves again. So you basically just forget the skeptical challenge. As Hume said, carelessness and inattention alone afford any remedy. But luckily, we can have carelessness and inattention. So there's, I suppose, some important way in which this third option seems to kind of concede Rinaldi's point. The anti-skeptical moralist says that that epistemic considerations are not the only relevant consideration. We're permitted, or maybe even obligated, to maintain certain beliefs, even in the absence of evidence. And on this third option, you maintain your beliefs. And why are you maintaining your beliefs? Well, it looks like this is going to be driven by just the sort of moral considerations that Rinaldi is drawing on here. If you take this third option, then you're basically agreeing with Rinaldi when he says, and I quote, "We can refuse epistemic rationality's demands in such a scenario. We can quite easily be irrational. Fulfilling the requirements of rationality, whilst prima facie good, are just not worth the personal sacrifice to one's loving relationships." So, again, just to summarize this trilemma, there are three options for the external world skeptic, and all of them are bad. Option number one is to give up the belief that your children love you, and so end the relationship with your children. Option number two is to give up the belief your children love you, but continue the relationship with your children. Option number three is continuing to hold the belief that they love you, despite suspending judgment about whether they exist. And yes, I mean, the thought is that these are all bad options. Okay, so Rinaldi has a nice example of a kind of local skepticism about testimony that I think just helps to sort of illustrate the argument here. So we'll talk a bit about this. So suppose that Verity is an extreme doubter who relies only on her own reasoning before accepting any claims. I mean, basically she has this attitude of, I believe it when I see it. And Verity starts a relationship with Sydney, but because she has this attitude of I'll believe it when I see it, she can never accept Sydney's testimony that he loves her. Now, of course, she doesn't outright disbelieve Sydney's testimony. She doesn't claim that it's false that Sydney loves her. She holds no belief either way on the basis of his testimony. But, maybe that doesn't matter so much because, look, she can make inferences from his behaviour, which she has directly experienced. She doesn't really need his stated testimony because she can look at his actions towards her. But, of course, she can always doubt things a bit further. And when she considers the various experiences that she has had with Sydney, she reasons that maybe she doesn't remember those experiences correctly. Maybe her memory is a result of motivated reasoning. She would very much like a loving relationship, so she thinks, look, this is something I want to be true, so maybe I'm just constructing a story for myself where it seems true. But maybe what's really going on is that we're just emotionally dependent on each other. So she has this alternative hypothesis, right? You know, one hypothesis is the love hypothesis. Verity and Sydney both love each other. But then there's this alternative hypothesis, the dependence hypothesis, which is Verity and Sydney are just emotionally dependent on each other. It's not really love, it's just emotional dependency. And Verity can point out to herself, well, wouldn't my experiences and memories be just as they are now, even if it were not really love, but mere emotional dependence? Of course, this is similar to the skeptic's appeal to an alternative possibility like the brain in a vat. You know, my experiences would be indistinguishable, even if I were a brain in a vat. There's nothing I can do, Verity says to herself, to rule out this dependence hypothesis, so I can't really believe that we love each other. So, Verity doesn't believe that Sydney loves her. Now, if Verity expresses her doubt, she's going to drive Sydney away. I mean, it's going to hurt Sydney's feelings for Verity to tell him that she doubts whether he loves her. It's going to potentially end the relationship, which would be a serious deprivation for Verity. Could Verity keep her doubts to herself? Well, yes, she could, but then she's still, you know, she's doing something questionable here, missing out, because she's basically lying. She's hiding from Sydney something that is actually of crucial relevance to their relationship. Verity is behaving in a morally questionable way, regardless of whether Sydney really exists. I mean, the point is, if Sydney does exist, she's lying to him, and lying is a problem. By choosing to pursue these sorts of skeptical arguments, Verity is choosing to behave in ways that hurt her loved ones. So if it's possible that her loved ones exist, you know, and even as a skeptic, you should admit that it is possible they exist, then she shouldn't be behaving in this way. So this kind of case just helps to sort of illustrate the problem that the external world skeptic will find themselves in. There's actually, though, what's interesting about this case is I think there's another moral challenge to skepticism that's hinted at with this case, although Ranelli doesn't explicitly state it, but I think it's just worth pointing out. So Ranelli says, you know, consider what we would think of a person who tries to prey on Verity's anxieties, right? So Ranelli says, like, imagine somebody who says to Verity, you know, why would anybody love you, right? Like, this person demands that Verity produce a justification for thinking that she is worthy of love. So, you know, the person says, like, how can you rule out that they're faking it? How can you rule out that you even experience love? Maybe it's just emotional dependence. And it's not very hard to put pressure on Verity. And Ranelli's point with this example is just, well, obviously Verity would be better off ignoring this troll. But there's another point here as well, which is, we might think, well, you know, it's unethical to attack Verity's beliefs in this sort of way. So it looks like we have a similar trilemma with the expression of skeptical views. So if you endorse external world skepticism, you have one of three options. Option number one is to refrain from ever expressing your views to others, which means giving up on an important kind of social interaction. After all, one of the great joys of life is talking about your views with other people. If you're the kind of person who has been persuaded by arguments for external world skepticism, you're probably the kind of person who likes philosophy, and that means you're the kind of person who likes talking about stuff with other people. It's important to exchange your ideas, right, so you can hear the responses and challenges to your views, and if you just keep all your skeptical views to yourself, you'll lose out on this. Again, most people would consider it to be a bit of a disaster if there was nobody else to share their views with. I don't really get it, to be honest. I'd be happy to just blow up everyone else in the world, but most people would consider this a disaster. I wouldn't really. There are some people I'd like to keep around. I don't know, like maybe 5 or 6. Anyway, next option is to express your skeptical sentiments, but then this is going to be outright cruel to other people if those people do exist. Option number 3 is to continue to express ordinary beliefs, in which case you're simply lying. Now, of course, running this argument does require us to justify the claim that expressing skeptical sentiments about people's relationships would be cruel or hurtful, without presupposing any contingent features of human psychology. After all, the external world skeptic suspends judgment about how other humans think and feel, or indeed whether there are any humans at all. So we'd need an argument to show that, okay, if humans existed, creating doubts about intimate relationships would be morally wrong. I guess the key is going to be the second point, right, which is that there's something cruel about expressing these skeptical views, or it's morally wrong to express these skeptical views, even if you're suspending judgment about whether there are other people, because without that the argument would beg the question, just like the first moral argument that appeals to local harmful skepticisms. But anyway, I thought it was worth just noting that there is perhaps this other argument that's very similar to the argument Ranelli gave in terms of setting up a trilemma for skepticism. Okay then, let's turn to some objections. So first of all, there is what we might call the stalker challenge. Ranelli raises this point in a footnote. So we imagined that Verity is presented with a skeptical challenge. It seems to her as though her partner loves her, but she cannot justifiably believe this because she can't rule out these alternative scenarios. The skeptic attempts to undermine Verity's belief that she is loved. Moralism instructs Verity to ignore the skeptic. That's all fair enough. We'll now consider a slightly different case. Let's say that Ian is stalking Barbara, and he's convinced that Barbara loves him. But from our point of view, we can just see it's very clear that, Barbara is not interested in Ian at all. But as Ian sees it, every interaction with Barbara only indicates that she loves him too. I mean, maybe Ian says to himself, oh, well, she's just playing hard to get. So here's the challenge, right? Both Verity and Ian have, I guess, appearances to them that suggest X loves me, right? And we want to say, in Verity's case, it is right for Verity to ignore the skeptical challengers to X loves me, the alternative hypothesis on which, despite the fact that it appears that X loves me, it's not true that X loves me. It's right for Verity to ignore these alternatives. But in Ian's case, it's clearly not right for him to ignore these alternatives. Ian should be more skeptical, and he should give up his belief that Barbara loves him. So the challenge is, well, what's the difference? What's the relevant difference? If the moral argument, if the moral argument is okay for Verity, why isn't it okay for Ian? If it's okay for Verity to ignore the skeptic for this reason, why isn't it okay for Ian to ignore them for this reason? So in response to this, Ranelli distinguishes two types of cases, two types of things that might be going on with Ian. In the first type of case, we can suppose that Ian is aware of contrary evidence, but basically just ignores it. So Ian knows that Barbara is telling him that she's not interested, and he knows that generally when people say they're not interested, that just means that they're not interested. But Ian is just ignoring it. He's ignoring the evidence. And this makes Ian, well, irrational, and in a sense it puts him in the position of the skeptic rather than the anti-skeptic, because Ian needs to come up with implausible scenarios, implausible alternative hypotheses to explain away Barbara's protestations. And Ian is clearly blameworthy in this case. I mean, he's ignoring or dismissing the obvious. Indeed, I suppose in this case we might doubt whether he really believes that Barbara loves him, because he himself recognizes that he has evidence against his belief, but he finds convoluted ways to dismiss it. So that's the first sort of case. In the second kind of case, Ian just doesn't recognize any contrary evidence in the first place. Everything Barbara does genuinely seems to Ian to indicate her interest in him. So when Barbara says she's not interested, Ian genuinely interprets that as an expression of love, and he just sees it as more evidence in favor of the hypothesis that she loves him. He doesn't need to dismiss the evidence because he thinks it supports his beliefs. Now, Ranelli's response in this case is brief. He just says, the stalker's rationality is compromised by their delusion. One might not even be subject to epistemic blame if the delusion is strong enough. So the difference in this case seems to be, well, Ian is just delusional. Ian's delusional, Verity is not. Now, maybe that point about him being delusional is sufficient to address our judgments of blameworthiness. Maybe we'd say Ian is blameworthy in the first case, but not the second. I'm a little unsure how this helps to answer the challenge, however, that the stalker challenge, as stated, because it seems to me that the point of the challenge is, how do I, from my point of view, tell whether my situation is analogous to Verity's or to Ian's? I mean, maybe I can be confident that my situation is not analogous to Ian in case 1, because I can be pretty confident that I'm not just ignoring any important evidence. I mean, even that actually isn't entirely obvious, because a person might, genuinely have insecurities that lead her to wonder whether she's doing what Ian is doing, But anyway, let's just say, okay, case 1, fine, right? I know that I'm not just ignoring evidence, but what if my situation is analogous to Ian in case 2? I mean, how do I know that I'm not delusional in the way that he's delusional? I mean, okay, maybe you say Ian isn't blameworthy in case 2, but so what? I mean, the point is, it would be better if Ian was more critical of his belief that Barbara loves him. He should be more critical, right? That's true in both cases, in case 2 and in case 1, and it's not clear that there's, again, what do I, from my point of view right now, do to rule out that I'm in this sort of case? I'm not really sure what the answer to that is. And notice, incidentally, that, look, stalking is an extreme case here, but there are more everyday examples. So, let's say that Delia is in a long-term relationship. We can see that this relationship has turned sour, but Delia's invested a great deal of time and energy into it, and so she desperately wants it to work. It's obvious to the rest of us that the relationship is unsalvageable, but Delia is persuaded by anti-skeptical moralism, and so she goes ahead and continues believing the relationship is all good anyway. How are we distinguishing, Verity's case from Delia's? We want to say Delia should be more doubtful about her relationship, and how do we know whether, how do I know whether my situation is like Verity's or like Delia's, right? That's the question. Okay, here's another objection. So we saw that in the trilemma proposed by the moralist, one option is continuing to engage in close relationships without the belief that the other person even exists, but you just continue with the relationship anyway. And Ranelli objects to this, that, it's prima facie wrong to lack intimate interpersonal belief while continuing to engage in intimate interpersonal action. This is what drives the claim that continuing to engage in those relationships is morally bad. But should we accept this moral claim? Well, first of all, it's worth noting that there are pretty clearly some popular moral theories that I think would just reject this claim, like utilitarianism. For the utilitarian, the only consideration is whether an action would increase happiness. Engaging in intimate relationships may well increase happiness for all the parties concerned, even if one person happens to lack a relevant interpersonal belief. Now, it is also possible that holding the interpersonal belief would increase happiness too, but that just seems to be a contingent psychological matter. I'm sure there's some people who, they could just continue with the relationship without the relevant belief, and it would be fine. It wouldn't make any difference whether they hold the belief or not. Now, it's probably also the case that the expression of the skeptical attitude might hurt a loved one's feelings. I mean, if Verity is in a relationship with Sydney and Verity tells Sydney that she doesn't believe he exists, yeah, that might hurt his feelings. But Verity could just keep her skepticism to herself. This perhaps would involve lying, and, normally we think lying's morally wrong, but again, a utilitarian is not going to say that there's anything in principle wrong with lying. Putting aside utilitarianism, maybe the reason why we accept this norm is just because we assume that certain interpersonal beliefs can be justified. We live in a culture that accepts the common sense framework. People trust perception, they assume there is an external world, and in that context, when a person says that they suspend judgment about whether another person exists, it's natural to think like, oh, so what, you just see me like I'm a fictional character or something? But I don't know, how might people feel if external world skepticism started being taken more seriously? Well, maybe we would just stop putting so much weight on, the idea that, you have to have beliefs in each other's existence. Maybe belief would just stop mattering so much if we had that sort of culture. Look, for what it's worth, I find skeptical arguments compelling. And, I wouldn't be remotely bothered if the people that I love were to accept skeptical arguments as well. If the people I loved suspended judgment about my existence, it just wouldn't bother me. I'm actually much more concerned about their actions and their feelings, about what Ranelli called the phenomenology of care. So basically, the way I see it is, I feel a certain way towards the people I love. I hope they feel something like the same way towards me. Of course, because as I said, I'm persuaded by these skeptical arguments, I don't really have any justification for that. I just kind of hope it, right? But when I love somebody, I don't demand that they have any particular beliefs about me, or indeed any particular feelings about me. My love for a person wouldn't be diminished just because they don't love me back the same way that I love them. And if I discovered that they had doubts about whether I loved them, well, I wouldn't really feel hurt or betrayed. I suppose I would sympathise, given my own inclinations towards skepticism. And I would feel, actually, pretty good that, look, despite their doubts, they've chosen to take a leap of faith on me anyway. I mean, that's one way for a skeptic to think about love. It's like, look, you're both in a state of ignorance, but you both take this leap of faith on each other. Isn't there something kind of romantic about that? I mean, it seems like you might be able to frame that in a romantic way. Indeed, I wonder if the skeptic might be able to turn the tables on the moralist here, because the moralist is saying, look, it's morally wrong to continue a loving relationship with your children, even if you don't believe your children exist. This is morally wrong because you'll have to suspend judgment about whether, for instance, the children love you back. But it might be argued, well, actually, no, there's something morally suspect about making a loving relationship with one's children dependent on the belief that those children exist. That's what's morally wrong. You shouldn't make your relationships dependent on having these beliefs, which are, which have really shaky evidential grounds for them, as demonstrated by the skeptical arguments. Especially once you consider the skeptical arguments and you see how all of this is just it's just built on nothing, right? It's like you shouldn't make your relationships dependent on these beliefs. That's morally wrong. That's a morally wrong thing to do. You should have a different attitude to your relationships so that you're not making them dependent on beliefs that might just get, washed away when you just think through some skeptical arguments. I wonder how my mother would have reacted if God had revealed to her that I don't exist. She wouldn't have loved me any less, is the answer to that. I suppose, it might have concerned her to some extent that I don't exist, but I don't think it would have in any way. I don't think it would have changed her attitude at all, actually. I similarly wonder. I wonder how, So as I say, I am pretty compelled by the skeptical arguments, and so I do in fact doubt that my mother ever existed, and. So I wonder, to put her in the position here of, let's say God reveals to my mother that, I don't believe she exists, or even that I don't even love her. Let's say God revealed that to my mother. My guess is that she would say, well, so what? It's impossible for my son to love me in the way that I love him. And that was, as far as I can tell, her actual opinion, that I could never really know or feel what she felt for me. I think her attitude would have been that I'm in a sort of Mary's room situation with respect to the feelings she had for me. Actually, what's interesting is that from the moralist's point of view, it seems that there's actually something morally wrong with my mother's opinion here, that it was somehow cruel of my mother to believe that I could never love her like she loved me. That just strikes me as totally absurd. I don't think that was wrong at all. It seems like it was actually part of what made her such a wonderful mum. So I just don't, I don't know. I don't have any inclination to think that I was in any way being wronged by what I'm guessing my mum would sometimes have thought, which is that my son is just never going to know this, this feeling. Okay, so there's that. Another objection. So one question we might raise here is, is the moralist actually offering an anti-skeptical argument? So the initial question which led us to external world skepticism was basically like, look, what are we justified in believing? And when we're talking here about epistemic justification, right? So like, what beliefs actually have evidence in their favour, and what counts as evidence anyway? And the skeptical challenge is, none of our beliefs are epistemically justified. Now, if the moralist is granting that there is no epistemic justification, it looks like she has conceded everything that the skeptic wants. As I noted at the beginning, moralists do not need to grant this. But moralism doesn't in itself argue for epistemic justification. Even if a moralist happens to believe that we have epistemic justification, that's not what moralism is arguing for, right? Like, the moralist is just saying, well, regardless of whether there's epistemic justification, you can still hold your beliefs. So it's worth considering here, like, another character that I'm calling the knowledge conservationist, which is analogous to moral conservationists in moral error theory. Moral error theorists hold that all moral claims are false. I have a video on moral error theory, which I will link in the comments. So, moral error theorists, they hold all moral claims are false. Moral conservationists are error theorists who recommend continuing to hold moral beliefs anyway, despite recognizing that those beliefs are false. And again, I have a video on this. It's moral error theory now what? I'll link that in the comments too. But so, a moral conservationist, basically, what they try to do is they just try to forget all of the arguments for error theory. So it's like, yeah, when you're talking about philosophy, thinking about meta-ethics, you realize that all moral claims are false, but as soon as you go back to ordinary life, you just put those arguments to one side and you start believing in morality again, and you start believing that there are moral truths. The moral conservationist wants to just conserve our moral practices as they are, despite the falsehood of morality. Similarly, the knowledge conservationist thinks that most of our ordinary knowledge claims are false, or at least she suspends judgment about them. We have no good epistemic reason to believe that we have hands, and so on. But the knowledge conservationist doesn't give up their knowledge claims, right? She just continues to hold all her ordinary beliefs and continues to regard those beliefs as knowledge. And if asked why she holds this view, she may elaborate by talking about the negative moral consequences of skepticism. So, when she's in the seminar room, she sees the power of the skeptical arguments. As soon as she goes back to ordinary life, she forgets all that stuff and just takes it that she knows things. Now, the moral conservationist is not giving an argument against moral error theory. In fact, they are moral error theorists. She argues that what she's arguing is, we should believe that there are moral facts. She doesn't argue that there are moral facts. Similarly, the knowledge conservationist, it seems, is not giving an argument against external world skepticism. She argues that we should believe that we have knowledge, not that we actually have knowledge. So it seems that the knowledge conservationist is not actually an anti-skeptic, right? But the thing is that moralism is really just an argument for knowledge conservationism. So, is it an argument against skepticism? That's perhaps questionable. One answer to this is what Ranelli calls encroachment moralism. According to encroachment moralism, there is not actually a distinction between epistemic norms and moral norms. The moral properties of a belief can affect the epistemic properties of the belief. So according to encroachment moralism, belief in the external world is epistemically justified because of the moral argument, basically. So actually skeptical arguments do fail on their own terms. So the encroachment moralist might say, for instance, that you have epistemic justification for a belief just in case you can rule out all of the relevant alternatives to that belief. Then skeptical hypotheses, such as the brain in the vat hypothesis, are not relevant alternatives. They have to be excluded from consideration due to their disastrous moral consequences. So what counts as a relevant alternative depends on moral considerations. But again, whether a belief is epistemically justified is whether you can rule out all the relevant alternatives, and what counts as a relevant alternative depends on moral considerations. So the moral facts are going to influence whether a belief is epistemically justified. So yeah, I mean, the thought is, look, knowing propositions about the external world does not require ruling out the brain in the vat hypothesis, because the brain in the vat hypothesis is not a relevant alternative due to its bad moral consequences. And if you accept this view, then you're going to say, actually, no, the skeptical arguments do fail. We do have epistemic justification. We really do have knowledge. It's not just that we should believe that we have knowledge, it's that we really do have knowledge. Anyway, I'm going to end it there. That's it. That's the end of that video. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.